Yeah, thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about this important subject. I'd also like to congratulate Bob and his staff for the great work they've done to date with the conference, and it'd be remiss of me if I didn't get a free kick away. Obviously, pretty disappointed with the federal government with respect to the ISC funding and what's going to happen from July next year. So from our perspective, from the ETU's perspective, we're fully supportive of EOS, and we'll do everything in our power to make sure that they are the service provider that we need, much need in this industry, looking after our training package moving forward. Competency-based progressions, obviously a very hot topic, particularly for us, where we're representative of over 65,000 workers in this country. Competency-based progression is not something that's new. It's been something that's been around and been debated for a long period of time. But for us, as a union and looking after those 65,000 plus workers, we think the time-based processes work well for our industry. It's been able to capture not only the necessary on-the-job and off-the-job capacity, but it's given people an opportunity over time to develop their skill sets necessary to make them a productive and safe worker for a period of time to come. It's also ensured quality trade outcomes. It's also ensured that we've met the licensing requirements, and that's because we've had the capacity to do that, progress during the time-based process with national assessments through Capstone and the like. And that's why the ETU absolutely supports the time-based progress, and our Divisional Council, which is the peak decision-making body of our union back in 2011, reaffirmed our position for that case. I guess part of the debate's been generated around what we would call the myth and the hype around the supposed skill shortages, and I challenge each and everyone in this room to have the debate with me and others about the skill shortages that we are supposedly facing, and the federal government and others trying to put out there the situation that we need to invest in overseas labour and the like to try and address some of these skill shortages, and also about the retention rates amongst apprentices. We say it's a myth and a hype, and there's more work that can be done domestically here to try and resolve those issues rather than look overseas to the solution. But that has caused immense pressure on our industry to look at the way our training packages are developed, to look at the way we're training apprentices, to try and accelerate people through a system to get a product at the end to try and address these skill shortages. That, along with other industries who've adopted the competency-based model, has increased those pressures that our industry faces with respect to this debate. However, unlike many other industries, this, as you all would be aware, the electrical industry is unique, because if we don't train someone appropriately and they don't have the necessary skill sets to do the task that they've got to do, then they're likely to hurt themselves or others. And in our industry, electrical incidents probably will lead to serious injury or death. And that's an unfortunate part about the process, but we're all aware of that of industry participants. So we're a unique industry when it comes to trying to ensure that does a competency-based model apply to our industry, should it apply to our model, when they're trying to compare us with other like sort of industries. And that's why, as I said earlier in my opening remarks, as a representative of over 65,000 electrical workers in this country, we want to make sure that we're front and centre of the debate about competency-based progression. We want to make sure that any competency-based system has enough safeguards and rigour in place to ensure worker safety, because that's the fundamental, one of the fundamental jobs that we do, one of the fundamental rights that we try and instill in every single workplace is that workers are represented and they've got a safe workplace and they've got industrial representation. And the important part about that is ensuring that they don't harm themselves or others through their conduct. As most of you will be aware, the ETU is supportive of the current pilot program undertaken by EOS. We had a significant internal debate within our union about whether we should support it or shouldn't support it. But to be quite frank, with the amount of pressure that's been placed upon this industry from the federal governments and state governments, industry participants about the competency-based progression system, we had to be an active participant. We had to be involved in it. We had to ensure that what we wanted to do was evaluate the process, because competency-based progression is something that needs to be evaluated in our view. We need to go through this pilot program, look at the pluses and minuses of it, and then after that have a rigorous debate about whether it should be something that we adopt or not adopt. And any move to a competency-based system needs to be considered, carefully considered. Like I said, in that rigorous debate needs to occur after an evaluation is undertaken. And the only way we're going to be able to do that is once we see the results, the end product of this pilot project. The important part about the pilot project for us at the moment is it's got some key principles. The readiness assessment is critical in our view. When I talked about earlier about retention rates in the electrical industry apprentices, we embarked on a significant campaign a couple of years ago to try and increase wages and conditions for apprentices to try and increase retention rates. But also during that process we engaged some academics to have a look at why people as electrical apprentices were coming out of the industry, and one of them was because probably about, I think it was about 14 or 15% of them didn't have the necessary skills and the education and the upfront literacy and numeracy to actually conduct themselves as an electrical apprentice over that period of time. So the readiness assessment for us is critical. You know, if we're going to go to a competency-based system, we're going to rely on a training system where people can advance, you know, where they and others think that they're competent to continue to the next stage. We need to make sure that at the front end, they're ready and available. I've been fortunate enough through this role to travel to overseas countries. Denmark, for example, they put their apprentices through, before they even award an apprenticeship, they put them through 12 weeks literacy and numeracy training before they even commence their apprenticeship. So that's a key essential ingredient for us as any part of any competency-based progression system. Also, extensive mentoring. That's another key principle that we support strongly. There's got to be the capacity for the students, the apprentices, to go and have those discussions that they need to with their mentors. Electronic profiling, obviously, and industry-agreed progression points. We are all here as industry participants, and we need to agree on what it takes to progress from one stage to the next, and that's something that needs to be considered carefully. And also, at those progression points, there needs to be agreed assessments. They're essential, in my view, of trying to establish industry confidence in this process. Our concerns about competency-based progression is that it's going to be used as a vehicle for some that have self-interest to try and accelerate the process and dilute the current standards of our trade. I don't think anyone sets out intentionally to do that, but when there's opportunities available to try and fast-track the process, then obviously some of those self-interested groups and individuals will do their best to undermine the process, and that has serious implications for the safety of themselves and others. Much more needs to be done with respect to competency-based progression. Obviously there needs to be some serious discussion amongst the industrial parties about what happens with wage progression and the like, but they are stuff that can be talked about and can be resolved over a period of time. But I think the key issue with this is those industry benchmarks. How do we establish and how do we make sure that there's rigour in the process, so when someone gets to stage one, they believe they're competent, their employer believes they're confident, the RTO believes they're competent. How does industry make sure that we have the necessary safeguards in place that is actually the case? That they're not going to advance into the second year, third year, fourth year without the necessary skills that they should have at that period in time, and I think that's an important aspect of the competency-based progression argument and debate. The pilot program will certainly provide a great insight for us into how the competency-based progression may work and may be incorporated in the electrical industry. And as I said before, we'll be an active participant in that process and we'll watch closely the outcomes of it. And I'd enjoy the debate that we have here today with respect to whether or not we should incorporate it more fully. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction and the pronunciation of my name. I have Farone, but it's Italian Faraone, but it's lovely for that. Thank you. Thank you for EOS for the invitation to come and speak here today. It's a great pleasure to be here. Holmes Glen Institute is the largest training provider and public trade provider in Victoria. It's an operation of $160 million. We have over 50,000 enrolments annually. We deliver programs in the trade areas, vocational, paraprofessional, and also in higher education. So it's a very comprehensive provider of public education for some time. Before I start talking specifically about competency-based progression, I want to talk a little bit just about what the vocational sector is facing at the moment, not only in Victoria but right throughout the country. It's major reform in the same way that the industry skills councils are facing major reform. The vocational sector is facing major reform, and the reason why I want to talk about it before I talk specifically about the competency-based progression is that it will have an impact on industry. It has an impact on potential students and certainly in the trade areas, and I think it's important that we look at the context. It's not only major reform in Victoria, but it's right across the country. So what we're seeing is a new funding model, a competitive funding-based model for all of the vocational sector right across the country. In Victoria, for example, they spend $1.2 billion and it's now open to 500 providers. The dollar bucket, it's not getting bigger, but the market is now managed by changing the funding rates for each hour of training. So in Victoria, we have rates ranging from $1 to $11, and you're pleased to know for the trade areas it's most expensive at $11 per hour of training. The vet product now is a commodity, and it is a commodity that is being sold and purchased, and it's a very big change to what the vocational sector was like in 5 years ago and even 2 years ago. And what we will start to see is the impact of that change on providers, but also on the end users. So it's on industry and on students themselves. Unfortunately for the TAFE sector, the students are voting with their feet, and partly we're looking at why this is. A lot of it is about having to put the cost now back onto students in tuition fees. But you'll notice, I won't go through all the dot points there, but this is from a report that Victorian Government's done on the first 6 months of this year. And TAFE provision now, or public provision now in Victoria is only at 27%. So we've lost market share from about 60 to 70% to 27%. And the proportion of students in government subsidised training at a TAFE have declined 12% from 2013 and 14. Now, I'm not here to complain about TAFE or funding for TAFE, but simply that it is going to have an impact on the way that we do things and how industry and students look at us. TAFE is still the dominant provider of training to apprentices, and that's really as a result of the infrastructure that we have. My organisation is a very large organisation. We have 4 major campuses, and we deliver trades in all areas apart from automotive. And so we have a lot of infrastructure and the facilities in place to undertake that training. So TAFE is still the dominant player in training to apprentices. And enrolments in apprentices have remained reasonably stable for the first half of this year. We're beginning to notice a bit of a decline in the building and construction area at our TAFE and across Victoria as well. And interesting to note that a lot of the training at in Victoria in public and private is at that Certificate 3 and 4 level. The interesting thing for us in Victoria is that youth unemployment in Victoria is extremely high, and in some regions it's about 40%. I went to Spain earlier this year to speak at an international conference on the Australian vocational sector, and Spain was experiencing and is experiencing youth unemployment at around 50%. And I think in Australia we always thought we were a bit immune from what's happening right around the world, but it is becoming scarily real that we have a real problem with youth unemployment. And if you just note the second dot point on that slide, the number of students aged 15 to 19 in government subsidised training has declined 8%. So what we're beginning to see is that a lot of people are being disengaged from training, and I think it's remiss of us and government to not start looking at these facts. So these people are not going to training or in employment, and so what we're seeing with the new funding model is that it is deterring a lot of people, young people in particular, getting into training. Obviously, the indications are that we at TAFE are losing ground in this vocational sector. Victorian TAFE has been advised that we have no community obligations. In other words, we have no obligations to the community in providing particular programs. And the challenge for me as Chief Executive of a very large TAFE provider is that I have to now balance the requirements of running a very large business that is now required to provide a return of investment to the Victorian government, and then also maintain that role in the community for social inclusion and social cohesion, and how we actually do that. We are in transition. My particular TAFE, we've lost 30 million annually as a public provider. We've had a reduction of 35% in real funding. What we are now in is a transformative process to be more competitive and sustainable. And what we will see in Victoria is probably not all TAFE providers surviving. May or may not be a good thing, but that's certainly going to be a reality that they are not going to survive. The one thing that will, I think, distinguish us and distinguish those that are sustainable is the partnerships and innovative delivery models and key strategies for future sustainability. Partnerships for us is a real key ingredient to our future sustainability, and we are working with a number of industries, and in particular industries here in the electrical area. But one I'd just like to briefly speak about, and I think it's a great example of how public providers can work with industry. It's not in this particular area, it's in the health area, but we have struck a deal with HealthScope, a very large provider of health training hospitals, and they are building a 300-bed hospital on one of our campuses. And one of the reasons why we've gone into this is that we do training in nursing and allied health, and both at the vocational level and higher education level, and that partnership has as part of it an underlying education agreement. So what we do from a business perspective is underlined by an education agreement. They're the sorts of things that we want to see continue at our organisation, and they're the ones that are going to ensure our future sustainability and also our future relevance to the industry. Competency-based progression. The vision, as you know, is to maintain integrity and quality of training and assessment whilst enabling greater flexibility for apprentices to progress that is commensurate to their capacity. From our understanding, and we have some staff here in the area who can talk much more comprehensively about it, but that it has support from some employers, support from some RTOs, and support from some students. It's not universally accepted nor appropriate to all student needs. What it does require, and this is what we've found, is that it requires innovative delivery. Many of our teachers in the trade areas have been at the Institute, some of them for 20, 30 years. They've been pretty traditional in their approach to teaching and learning, and to be able now to move away from a traditional approach has been quite difficult for some of them. We have integrated delivery and assessment across engineering qualifications since 2008, and we're currently participating in the EOS Managing Apprentice Progressions pilot for one group. And we've also a member of the MAPS Implementation Committee, so we've been heavily involved to date. What are the outcomes of what we've seen? Well, actually not great for competency-based progression. We've had no loss of our first group. We've had no loss of apprentices from the group. However, 10 apprentices returned to traditional model and 5 have remained in the competency-based progression model. And I think that's a really interesting statistic in regards to I suppose, adapting the model to individual student learning needs. The employers of those 5 have been very satisfied with the program. But what it's made us think and look at is how we rethink our response and how employers assess students' suitability for competency-based progression. We have also to rethink our learning environment. In many respects, what we're trying to do with competency-based progression is fit a square peg into a round hole. The traditional classroom does not promote competency-based progression, and we have at the Institute recently spent $700,000 on refitting and refurbishing our electrical trade areas in particular to make them much more flexible learning spaces. You also have to have very supportive partnerships with employers and associations in order to make it work. Some of the recommendations that we have is that we have to rethink, as I said, rethink how we as an RTO and how employers actually assess students' suitability for competency-based progression. Is it simply a matter of saying everyone has to do it, or can we, or students pick and choose? We have to rethink our learning environments and our approach to teaching and learning. And we have to rethink how we deliver and assess to make it more learning for all students. However, to pick up on a point that Alan made, the reason why I mentioned the changes and the reforms to the vocational sector is that we have been asked as a public provider, and all providers in fact, to actually do more with less money. And my worry, picking up what Alan said, is that we cannot embark on competency-based progression as a way simply of reducing what we're doing for our students and for the employers. And so there is a real fear, I think, out there that the current environment will actually promote that. So from our perspective, as a very large TAFE provider, we're trying to ensure that we maintain the quality of our teaching and the quality of our learning for our students within a very difficult and restricting funding model. So that's the real challenge for us. But I just hope that other providers are doing it for the same reasons, and I think that is a real concern for the sector. Thank you.
And thank you to EOS for putting on this conference, and I must say I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to you all today. I've been charged with the responsibility of talking about the management or managing apprenticeship progression. We call it MAP, and we are part of the pilot program, similar to what Mary was talking about. But what I want to talk to you today about is our journey, as in PVET's journey. But before I do, I'd just like to give you a bit of background. PVET is an acronym for plumbing, electrical, electronic and refrigeration, vocational, education, employment and training. We've been in this business for 28 years, and we've been operating out of our Albert Park facilities in Adelaide. The first thing I'd like to talk to you today is about the importance of the communication process and planning process. Our journey began with our Chief Executive Officer, Michael Boyce. He had a very, very clear directive to the management, trainers, principal trainers, administration staff about where he saw peer being for the future. We had discussions before about future training, and it was just coincided that when EOS introduced the MAP program that we saw this as our opportunity to get on board with a big partner and trial this, and that's what we began to do. The program commenced in January 2013. The first thing we decided we needed to do was to set up what we refer to as a MAP committee. And the MAP committee, we sat and we meet regularly. We meet actually every week, and we still do, to ensure that we have crossed all the boxes as we go along. We then had to communicate with our employers, students, host employers about our intent to deliver the training at our college. And that was done through written communication and telephone conversations and a bit of support with some material from EOS as well. The next part of the program included infrastructure setup. Now, we haven't got $700,000 to set up infrastructure like the TAFE colleges do, of course, but we did dedicate a classroom, and we called it for our computer suite. We had to put in data cabling and switching to our servers to ensure that we could have our 16 laptops, because we have a classroom of 16 students, and provided them with laptops. Just on the laptop, we also introduced a Wi-Fi program, and within that environment, as an educator, we had to protect the students from the sort of material that they would access. So we've got what we call as a content keeper or a filtering system to prevent students from enabling pornography, gambling sites and other nasties like that. And that was quite an exciting process, I can assure you, and new to us. Just before I move on to that, I do apologise, that was a bit... we trialled our first group some 7 months later in July 2013, so it took us almost 7 months to develop and made sure that we're on track to introduce our first block release training as students. Keeping in mind, these students were familiar with lockstep training, so this was completely a new environment to them, and not only to them, to our trainers. And I could stand here and say that blended learning or LMS training is not for all trainers. Mary talked about some trainers struggling. They've been entrenched in the system for some 40-odd years. As a private training provider, we're not much different to that. But fortunately, we have what we call a MAP champion. His name is Phil Dodd, and we're lucky enough to have Phil Dodd with us today. So I would encourage anyone here today that if they want to learn about what the training aspect side of it looks like, is to grab Phil or Peter Jolly, our Training Services Manager, who also is with us today, to talk about the coalface and really what changes are like for trainers as well as the students. So the whole transitioning wasn't just about the students, as I say, it's about the whole way in which we develop and deliver our training. I mentioned the fact that we trialled our students. Online assessments was something that was very brand new to Peer, clearly, because it was something that we'd have done in lockstep fashion. And some of the benefits that we saw in the online assessments was the fact that the questions and the assessments have been through a national validation process, and it's a consistent process right throughout the country. The other thing, initially, the RTOs had no idea of what the questions were or the assessment they didn't get to see that at all. A 75% pass mark was introduced by the blended learning program, or the pilot program, and that's something that we weren't prepared for. We were sitting on a 65% program, and it wasn't a simple matter of saying, right, the pilot group would go to 75 and the rest of the electrotechnology students would go to 60 or stay at 65. It had to be across the board. So for that, we had to get board approval, and so in our electrotechnology field, we are at 75%. And we believe this has lifted the benchmark of the students that are doing the current assessments. As previously stated, the program commenced in July 2013 with a class of 16 block release, and block release is students who come for the whole week, and also we have day release students, but we started with a block release student so we could monitor them more carefully. Then we gradually transitioned our first year students, followed by all new enrolments from 2013. All new enrolments into the electrotechnology field went straight into our pilot program. We now have a total of 157 students working with the LMS. And it's interesting to say, or to note, that the students that went from lockstep into the blended learning model struggled a little bit. There's no doubt about that. The ones that know no different. And it's interesting because the surveys, we regularly survey our students along the journey, and that's what we found. Having said that, also, the ones that did go from lockstep into the LMS system are getting used to the idea. So it's like anything else, it's change, but it's working well. The EOS Mentor Advisors is part of the pilot program. Initially, there was a lack of communication, I must say, between the mentors and EOS management. With the clear direction of what their roles were and how they went out to industry. But I must say, we've got some fantastic mentors now that are doing a wonderful job. They're a direct link between the peer, the student and the employer. They're the coalface. They're talking to industry daily about what it's all about, so that they're taking that scare factor out of it. And it's been a wonderful advantage to our peer and assisting a smooth transition into the LMS system. Challenges to the program, and ladies and gentlemen, there have been some lumps in the road. Absolutely. This has not been an easy thing by any stretch of the imagination, which is change is normally not easy. As I mentioned before, we do survey our students, and their complaints are there's a lack of non-computer based training, so they feel that they're in front of a computer all day. Trainers still becoming familiar with the course material, and naturally you would. Trainers tied up with admin duties and not moving around the classroom on a regular basis as you would in a lockstep environment. Trainers adjusting to the new learning model themselves, as I mentioned before. This is not for all trainers. You have to be flexible in your thinking, think outside the square, and that's a challenge in itself for people that have been in the industry for many, many years. The mentor advisors, as I said before, the communication between the advisors and the EOS management improved out of sight. They're a lot happier, we're a lot happier with the way it's all coming together. One of the other biggest challenges is the trainers' time in administering the program. For instance, the trainers now are involved in managing student progression between phases 1, 2 and 3, so they've got to do that. Planning and booking online assessments. Overseeing students studying multiple units in the same class, unlike as a lockstep where they'll do this unit, they'll do an assessment at the end of the week and they'll move on to the next unit, whereas with blended learning or the LMS system, the teacher could have up to 3 or 4 units running at one time or open to the students at one time. Therein lies another challenge, but it's not something that we actually can control. It's just another way of thinking about it and working out ways we can do it better. The other thing is also is tracking the students' progression against nominal hours. We need to focus, and we need to, as an RTO from a business side of view, if there's a 40-hour unit, how long is a student spending on the unit? Because you've got to learn how to do that. And what we've done, because I believe that with EOS and PEER, we've been at the coalface and we've gone shoulder to shoulder and almost pioneering this program. No one gave us lessons on how to administer this. This is something that the MAP committee on the weekly journey had to work out, well, how do we monitor how long students have been on the LMS system, and how do we control all that? So yeah, as I said, it's certainly been very, very challenging, but rewarding. Now to a bit more positive approach, the benefits to the program from where peers stand, and that is that we have the latest resources available through the LMS. It enables the RTO to maximise student class sizes, and that's done because instead of booking students in or scheduling them in to do units, we schedule them into the phase. So they can do multiple units, so we can top up the class when need be, and students are able to, if they miss a day of college, they're able to catch up far more quickly because they'll just pick up where they left off instead of missing out and having to be rescheduled in a few months' time. The national pass mark raised to 75%. We believe that we are seeing a significant improvement in the student outcome as far as the benchmark. Using a national standardised assessments that are conducted by a third party, as in they're conducted by EOS, so we don't get to comment or see anything of that. We do believe, using the LMS, that students do gain a broader knowledge of the unit. Because if we don't know what the questions are, the students have to focus more intent on the whole of the subject, because, as I said, we have no idea what questions will be thrown at them and what answers they'll need to give. The other benefit is that students can access the LMS away from the college. They can use it at home, obviously, and wherever they need to, they can access their subject matter. We had an incident a few months ago where we had a student with severe dyslexia, and it was told to me that this student wouldn't be suited to the program because of the slow learning that this student had. And I argued that that's not necessarily the case. If this student could spend more time at home in his own time accessing the unit and the subject matter through the after hours, that he could survive, and as it is, he did, and he's going along very well because of that, that system. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that's just about the end of my discussion this afternoon. So once again, thank you very much to you all.
My name's Kate Coates, I'm from AGL. I have a question for anybody on the panel, and that's to distinguish between competence and excellence, and how the two versions of training might address these, because the excellent trades of tomorrow are going to be the excellent mentors of our excellent apprentices. So interested in more than simply competence.
Who wants to start with that one? The difference between competence and excellence.
It's a very difficult question to start. This was a discussion, if I go back to the introduction of training packages, and Bob probably can help me when that was, I can't remember the actual year. I remember people went to a conference and everyone rushed out at some point and on phones and whatever, and curriculum is dead and long live competency. And it's been debated since that time, so over 15 years. We've worked with training packages for that period of time, and I think for many of our teachers, they still have a problem between competence and excellence. And what we have seen at the Institute is a blending of the two, in that a lot of the faculties have excellence as in grading, marks given, as well as competency attained. It's probably not the best model, but it's a model that's used within the Institute, not across the board, but certainly in some areas where students actually request a grade as well as a competency for resulting purposes. So it still, I think, poses lots of problems for RTOs. We manage it in this way, but I don't think it actually answers your question about, competence versus excellence. Because you go back to those discussions that, would you rather have a neuro surgeon who is competent or excellent, so, and the same with probably electrical, which is competent versus excellent. But really, the training packages and what's required for competence is really sort of excellence as well. Anyway.
Alan, David, do you have a view?
No.
No? Okay, we have another question over here.
Leng Saw from Ramia Site Skills. I think I'm just concerned about why there is some, lack of full engagement about competency-based progression. What do you think is the fundamental issue here? Is it a question of perhaps people are suspicious about the rigor of competency-based progression, that maybe trainees are being deemed competent when they really are not? Is that the fundamental issue? Why is there a bit of resistance to this change in time-based versus competency-based?
So is there a lack of engagement, or why is there both?
I think, if I can, obviously one of our concerns, as I mentioned in my discussions with the competency-based progression, is around, the training providers that we currently have in the system. Not all of them, to be quite frank, looking at the quality outcomes that we should be delivering. Because of the financial pressures that are being placed on a lot of the training providers, they're forced in a situation where, unfortunately, a lot of the students are getting treated as numbers rather than, students, and it's about the funding that they get for each of these students and how successful they will be in meeting their budgetary requirements and the like. So that thrown into the mix, where there's an opportunity to try and fast-track apprentices through a process without the appropriate rigour and safeguards in place, is of real concern to us, because unfortunately in all industries there's going to be people that'll try and take advantage of that, and they'll use those budgetary constraints or financial concerns as a methodology to try and increase the number of apprentices that they're putting through so they can get further funding. So that's one of our significant concerns with competency-based progression so far as is the quality and the oversight and the rigour and the process going to be carefully watched and considered through the whole process, or is it going to be something that's going to create an opportunity for those unscrupulous training providers out there? I'm not suggesting that there's many, but there is, to use it as an advantage to try and increase their bottom line.
Unscrupulous training providers, do you have a comment on it?
Well, we're not one, so that's my comment. I agree with Alan's comments that I think some people would take advantage of it. I don't think it's a lack of engagement from our perspective in regards to competency-based progression, but we look at what we're trying to concentrate on is quality inputs and quality outcomes. And as long as we can do that within a competency-based progression model, we will do it. But we have had resistance from teaching staff and also from some students, and it's not a model that is universally accepted, nor is it probably one that accommodates all students' needs.
And if I can add to that, one of the benefits that I didn't talk about the pilot program is that the profiling, and everybody understands the profiling. So because there's profiling outcomes before that the student can move on to the next phase, I personally believe that it's a more rigorous model than it is currently. So they have to have the skills off the job as well as on the job before they can progress. So you can talk what you like about rapid progression, but if the student's not competent on and off, they will not progress.
We have another question over here.
Ian Neeson, question for Mary probably. Mary, are you stifled by the way that you're funded for progression model? Do you get funded on the completion of units of students? Is that a barrier, or is there other ways in which you're funded? Because if it's completion of units, there would be a propensity to have students completed before you get your money.
That's right. For fear of boring you all silly before you go to lunch, I won't go into the depths of the funding model. We're actually funded on participation. So we have to show evidence of participation for every student who attends the institute. So, for example, I said that we generally get $11 per hour of training for apprenticeship training. So if students turn up, so we have 10 students in a class, they turn up for one block, fine, they're all there, we're paid for those hours that they attend for that block. The next block comes round, only 5 students turn up because, you know, they've been kept out at the employers or whatever the case may be. We're only paid for those 5 students for that participation. So unlike university funding, where the universities are funded for each student as long as they get to the point of a census date, so it's usually about a month or 2 months into the course. After that time, no matter if the student comes, deletes, withdraws, whatever, the university is paid for that student. The model in vocational is that students, we are paid for participation only.
Hi, thanks very much for 3 interesting presentations. I just want to try to link back to the keynote that we had this morning from Danny Kennedy, who painted a fabulous picture of a brave new world. And notwithstanding that clearly your sector and my sector, I'm from the Australian National University, are in a state of flux, and some of us a state of anxiety about what's going on. So at the moment, obviously, we're all in a very difficult place. But I wonder if you could comment, building on Danny's presentation this morning, to what extent do you think that your organisations are nimble enough, strategic enough, flexible enough, and enabled enough to be able to position the energy sector in this country for that brave new world that Danny has painted for us, and that is almost inevitably going to hit us in the next 5, 7, 10 years? Do you feel well placed to do that, or is it how much do we get per hour per student and that kind of thing? Is it being constrained at the moment? This idea that you could be strategic and visionary.
Who wants to tackle that one?
Or the training question.
Tackle that. We've obviously it's been the funding reforms in Victoria are now spread right throughout the country. So each state is being affected by similar funding reforms that we've seen in Victoria. It's actually meant that we've had to review everything within the organisation. We've actually commenced on an organisational review agenda, and it's really about renewal as well. We are probably not as agile as we should be for the future, and that's really what we now need to work on. But it's a very difficult issue for a very large organisation like ourselves. We have 1,000 employees. Many of them have been there for a long period of time. They're great teachers, many of them. And so it really means a change to industrial relations for us, which is what the government is wanting us to do. It costs my organisation 30% more to put a teacher in front of a class than a private RTO or probably an industry-based RTO because of conditions, all sorts of things. And I don't begrudge teachers those conditions or those salaries, but it's a fact of life that it costs us 30% more to do that. We have to now get much smarter about what we're doing because we are running a business, and that's what we've been told. We are running a business, and the Victorian government is wanting 8% return from TAFE providers in the future. 8% return for an organisation like mine, and it's based on our non-current assets, which are around $450 million, is a net result of, in the $40 million range. That's a very big ask for not only my provider, which our TAFE, which is really a very successful TAFE, but for a lot of other providers. So, in answer to your question, and I was thinking the same when I was listening to Danny about how does the training system adapt to the new world and new world of work, and I think probably we've always been a step behind, not only now, but I think probably, if I look back on the last 20 years, we've probably always been a step behind. Part of the answer also is relation to industry skills councils and the training packages as well, and what's in a training package and how much of that is future-proofing our workforce.
Just to give you a bit of the dilemma you face is the dilemma that's been highlighted by the federal government and the proposals that have been put to the federal government about the criticism of ISCs, the training package changed too often. Now, I met Danny 2 years ago. I knew what was coming. We're down the track of writing units that reflect the coming way. The moment we make a change to a training package that's an impact on an RTO's business, the complaint comes you're changing the training package too often. Or there's a policy decision from somewhere above that it affects your business because of the change. So the partnerships that we're going to have with RTOs, particularly with skills councils, on the sort of things we're talking about with Danny, we've known that's coming. We've got units already written. However, we changed the version of the training page with the implications it means to your business is huge. Recording systems, scope applications, all those things are something that somehow we have to work out together how that works, because we're at the coalface of what's happening. We're 5 years ahead of you guys knowing what's coming. Now, how do we write a training package that futurises the industry and a new electrical worker or a gas person or wherever? We can see that coming 5 years because we go to these things, these future things, and we write units. The problem we've got is we're criticised because we do that. Because the RTO businesses can't deliver or have to go through the process of change and then lobby the government to say there's too many changes. A real issue for us, and that was if you look at one of the major factors in McFarlane's speech, training packages change too much. what do? We're helping industry, you're trying to run a business, changes are there, how do you reduce those costs? And it's something that we have to have a long discussion about how that works.
The architecture of the Australia's vocational system is well renowned. Every time I go overseas, people talk about the architecture, the training packages, the industry skills councils, the providers, and how we're funded. But certainly from a large provider perspective, training packages, I think they're a great architecture. I think they're fabulous in having competency-based within qualifications. The problem is, and I think for you in particular, is how you do future-proof what you have in qualifications. And I think the answer is probably somehow in the flexibility of the qualifications and being able to pick and choose and do things like that, as opposed to having something set. But it's a very big question, and it goes back to your question of flexibility. Probably the same is said about universities as well, of being inflexible and not being able to adapt very quickly to change.
I think it's
David, sorry. Yep. Alan?
I think it also highlights the importance of industry skills councils, because the industry skills council is just that. It's made up of industry participants which recognise the need with emerging technologies that come through all the time. As Bob's already indicated, you know, they do industry snapshots and they do reviews of the industry and try and future-proof our industry to make sure we've got the adequate information and content in the training package. And that's why it's, you know, pretty disappointing for us as an organisation that the federal government's, you know, taken the funding away from these industry skills councils and going to a public sort of tender system. I think it's ridiculous when, you know, the industry are at the forefront. We're the practitioners. We understand what is required of our training packages. We have a massive vehicle through EOS to do that right now, and each of the industry participants are fully engaged in that process. And to try and move away from that and go to something else when, you know, you've got people coming in talking about all these renewables and emerging technologies and something that we have to adapt to, it's pretty scary for us, because I think we're going to sit in a period of time where we're in a hiatus until the federal government can realise that the Industry Skills Council do actually deliver, and it's good bang for buck. And I think it's about $3 million that they contribute of taxpayers' money to this Industry Skills Council, and it's well worth it. So pretty disappointing, but certainly that's why the Industry Skills Councils for us are so important.
Next question.
Russell Savage from EOS. I've had the benefit of being closely involved with the Energise Oz project as a mentor advisor in North Queensland. The question I have for the panel is more to do with you know, the blended learning aside, the readiness assessments aside, and the mentoring aside. What views might you have in terms of the benefits that the independent industry benchmark progression assessments might contribute to a model such as the one we're discussing today, which defines competency-based progression?
Who wants to lead on?
Yeah, I can only talk about the managing the apprenticeship progression through the MAP program, and having a national approach to assessments, having a national approach to benchmark assessments, RAs and all that, that must improve the overall quality of our apprentices, which leads on to, are we in a changing world? Do we need to be smarter and more technical and have a higher technical ability? Yes, we do. And I think, as I said before, having a national approach to this and all in will only serve to improve that.
Our next question.
Hi, Carl Copeland from the College of Electrical Training. Thank you for a very informative session, by the way. My question's to Mary. You stated that it costs the public provider 30% more than the private provider to deliver apprentice training. We've just actually had a survey and a study instigated by the Department of Training and Workforce Development completed in Western Australia. Stanton International completed that study that actually proved that it cost the private provider 16.9% more than the public provider. Could you comment on that?
The study. Ours is based on obviously what the salaries are for our teachers, the conditions that they work in, so the number of hours they teach, compared to the conditions and salary under the modern award that we know a number of private providers actually employ their staff. So I can't comment on the specifics you're talking about, but as an example, a trade teacher at our institute would teach 800 hours per year. The salary is, once you include on costs and whatever, is probably around $100,000. In many private providers, and we've done some work also in Victoria, which I'm happy to share with you if you would like that, through the Victorian TAFE Association, on this benchmarking. Many teachers in private providers, and I won't say for all, but certainly the some that we know, teach 1,000 hours and also are employed for the full year, so 38 hours a week or 37 hours a week, with 4 weeks annual leave. Our teachers have 30 hours attendance. They have 7 hours non-attendance, and also they have 20 days leave plus another 27 non-attendance days. So even from a sort of even if you take the salaries away, it's really the conditions that has the biggest impact from a cost perspective.
But just, sorry, it's hard without the microphone. The follow-up question?
Yeah, sorry, Mary, but if you offset those instructor costs, we have the same instructor costs, especially for apprentice, licensed electricians.
Yep.
Don't come cheap. If you also look at the overheads that the private provider has compared to the public provider, I think you'll find that it is the other way around.
Look, I'm not here to denigrate private providers at all. I think a lot of them do a good job and whatever. I was simply making a comment based on benchmarking that the Victorian TAFE Association had done in Victoria in regards to it. Certainly that's across the board, so for me to get any teacher up in front of a class will cost me more, but that doesn't obviously take into consideration particular programs such as, you know, the infrastructure of trade areas.
Shane Eels, ESIC Consulting. Just going to go back to a point that David made in his presentation, and it's always been a concern of mine, is why do we have a pass mark on the knowledge-based assessments? So if you say 75%, what 25% of the knowledge do you allow the student participant to fail on? And do you have critical questions? So therefore, if you have the critical questions that equate to 75%, is the other 25, or are the other 25% of the questions just making up and filling up space on the page? Because if we have knowledge that's required, surely it has to be 100%, because we have 100% on the skill sets out in the field. They have to complete that. You can't just say, oh, he met 50% of the on-the-job requirements, so therefore he's competent. So I've always had this problem with a pass mark, so why isn't it 100%? Thank you.
And David?
Yeah, thanks, Shane. It's a good question. Look, we need to be really careful that the 75% theory pass mark does not make up the whole package of an apprentice's competency. It's just part of it. And I would argue that pass marks have been around since day dot, and I can't explain why universities, for instance, don't introduce a 100% pass mark. I mean, it's something that we don't do. But please be assured that 75% isn't the pass mark for complete competency. It's part of it. There's also the off-the-job component. There's the employability skills that go with all of that. So it's just part of it.
Trent Bradley from IAC Safety. David, you said you've got your 157 students enrolled in the program now, and you've also increased the pass mark by 10%. Have you seen a change in the standard of the individuals or the quality of the outcomes for those individuals, and do you think it's linked to the increase in the pass mark or the change in the program?
Yeah, another very good question. To be honest, when we first introduced the 75%, we had struggled, and the students struggled slightly, And that's why the board struggled with approving the 75% pass mark, because if we've taught an entry-level student and the pass mark doing the same units at 65 and then introduce a 75% pass mark, there's an inequity there. So we've had to go back and rethink our whole model of how we introduce that. Your question was, have we seen an increase in the quality, or is it the pass mark or the LMS? It's both. Because the LMS, as I said in my presentation, doesn't pick on a certain area of the unit to be assessed in, and if we're being perfectly honest, RTOs in the past would tend to train students to the assessment, whereas using the LMS, they have to learn a broader range of the assessment of the unit so that they can cover off on it. So I think it's twofold. One, the 75%, because the students know they have to lift their game by 10%, and two, they do get a broader range within the unit and they know they've got to knuckle down and focus a lot harder.
Okay. Oh, yes, we have another one.
Morris Graham, EOS. I've been involved in the EMAP project over the last 2.5 years, and I agree with some of the things that we've found with RTOs, and I'll just probably, this is to Mary, with funding cutbacks, and it is not just in Victoria, it's across the country. How do we actually move towards true competency delivery with integrated classrooms, and we train our teachers up to a level that they're comfortable of running true competency-based training? And you know, we've done a lot of work on the ground, working with the teachers and with our mentor advisors and with EOS staff, and it is common across the whole country. A lot of the RTOs are struggling because of funding constraints. And the other thing that I find amusing, I used to run a private RTO on electrical in Victoria. The bureaucracy come along and say, we're running competency-based hours from next January, and they do nothing to actually bring the employers on board or the industry on board, and they just expect it to happen over and you know, magic wand, and competency training starts. So there's a lot of things that we have found in this project that going forward we're going to have to make sure is integrated into the true competency delivery within the RTO structure. So I just wondered, with funding constraints, how we're going to do that.
A good question. I think what it's meant for our organisation is that we are rethinking our model. It's part of an organisational renewal agenda, so we're rethinking everything that we do, and not from the point of view of trying to reduce quality inputs and outcomes, but how to be a lot smarter than we have been. And so that will be part of it. It's an unfortunate byproduct of any funding cuts that you're going to lose something along the way. And Alan was talking about when he did his presentation about foundation skills, literacy and numeracy as part of perhaps a need, especially for a lot of apprentices that we see at our organisation, not so much in electrical but across the board in others. And because of funding changes and eligibility, we now have many rules in Victoria in regards to who can access funding. There are eligibility requirements that you can't do more than two, you can't get government funding for more than 2 qualifications in a lifetime, and you cannot start 2 qualifications in any 1 year. So for apprentices, as an example, we last year used to run a literacy numeracy program in conjunction with their Certificate 3 in whatever discipline. We're unable to do that this year because of eligibility changes. So it's really unfortunate, and I did want to come here and harp on about funding, because that's not what we're talking about, but it is inevitable that the changes right across the country are going to have an impact on both the inputs, or certainly the input into training. And I think it's really up to training providers with industry and industry associations and the industry skills councils about how we now work together for a better product, because I think in working in isolation we're not going to be able to do it.
My name's Julie Binks from APA Group. I'm just wondering, we keep hearing about the lack of numeracy and literacy, And we've been encouraging through industry lots of vet programs in the education department and engaging them. I'm wondering if we have the ability or I suppose the persuasion with the government and the training department to push better literacy and numeracy to come out of the schools, or whether as industries we should be, if they're doing a Cert 2 for pre-apprenticeship for electrical, gas, whatever it is, that we insist that numeracy and literacy is a mandated part of that so that we don't have the problem when they come out.
Certainly be supportive, try and get into any mandatory inclusion of the literacy and numeracy up front, because when we did the apprentice case, like I said a couple of years ago, when we were striving to try and increase wages and conditions, part of the academic study that we got done showed quite clearly that, like I said, there was a strong percentage of students that weren't actually suitable for the electrical industry, and they didn't identify that until they got through their first year into the second stage. And that's a responsibility that we all have as industry participants, to make sure that we have the right candidates entering the electrical apprenticeship, because otherwise when someone enters that electrical apprenticeship, they get to their second stage and they drop out because they just don't have the necessary literacy and numeracy skills. That's an opportunity missed for some other student that could have gone through and done that apprenticeship. So I think there's a strong onus of responsibility on us to try and ensure that they do have the necessary literacy and numeracy skills up front. And it's difficult because there's a lot of people in our industry, in the electrical industry, sole traders, one-man bands that will throw on their mate's kid to do an apprenticeship, and they think they're doing the right thing by them, but that's part of the problem as well. So it's something that I think we really need to grasp with, and that's why, whilst we've been involved with the pilot project, if there is going to be a competency-based progression system that's implemented into the electrotechnology area, then I think that's one of the things we definitely have to make sure is up front.